It's not often that you get to be on a panel with three of the greatest cities in the world, New York, London, and Paris, and that was in no particular order there. But these are not just fabulous cities to visit and to live in, but they're all really ambitious on the climate agenda. All three of these cities have set targets to be carbon neutral or net zero emissions by 2050. So they have very ambitious climate agenda, and they've taken different approaches to help and deliver on that. So the focus of the discussion today is different ways in which these cities have used their power, including purchasing power, their regulatory authority, their soft power, to drive markets, to attract finance, and to advance their climate actions. So we're first going to hear about the three different initiatives that the cities are leading, and then in the second round of questions, we'll talk about the impacts these initiatives are having and how they're helping to drive the market. And at the end, hopefully, we'll have time for some questions. So let me start first with New York City, with our panelist, Mark Chambers, the Director of the Mayor's Office of Sustainability for New York City. So, Mark, we heard this morning from Dan Zarrilli about the really ambitious program New York has and the massive efforts you're doing to drive the retrofit agenda. We also heard from the last panel about the need for scale and how as big as these initiatives are, they're just a drop in the bucket in terms of what's actually needed. Can you tell us about how New York is using its massive purchasing power and its regulatory authority to drive its ambitious climate agenda?
Absolutely, and thank you for having us here, and thank you all for joining us in New York City. You know, I think that when we think about using power here in New York, we are very committed to doing whatever we can with whatever means we have in our control, whether that relates to zoning, whether it relates to energy codes, whether it relates to benchmarking, whether it relates, as you heard earlier, to large-scale divestment, whether it relates to legislated mandates of performance. We are leaving no stone unturned in terms of how we evaluate our options and how we act aggressively on them. I think that's the true nature of where cities shine, is our ability to be flexible and our ability to pivot, you know, as environments around us change. Yeah. One other point I'll make before I talk a little bit more specifically is that we often look at our purchasing power from the standpoint of being able to, you know, bend the cost curves of markets and being able to effectively reduce costs for everyone else and create value as a result. One other point I'll make, though, is that it's also an opportunity to look at our climate actions a little bit differently and are allowing us to look at how our climate actions can actually match our values. I think that one of the examples that I used often is that we need to be flexible in how we look at what climate actions are. It's not simply just a measure of looking at our building stock or looking at our transportation system or our waste system. We have to be far more invested in meeting people where they are. In New York City, we have something called Pre-K for All, which other cities have also explored, where 3- and 4-year-olds are able to go to school. In New York City, the scale matters, though. You know, when we're able to look at the potential of, you know, 62,000 3-year-olds being able to go to school free, and that's 100,000 plus parents potentially with time. You know, and I think those of us out there that have 3-year-olds can appreciate that. The ability for us to look at climate actions as being unlocking principles that unlock the potential of more people to be involved in this fight, I think is extremely important and extremely critical to how we look at what value we're creating in a city, whether it's the largest city in the U.S. or second and tertiary scale cities throughout. But more specifically, we look at our purchasing power of how it affects some of our biggest contributors to emissions. The building sector, transportation sector, waste sector, and energy sectors are among them. From buildings, we know that the lion's share of emissions in our city come from our building stock. There are 1 million buildings in New York City, actually 1 million. And we have to critically think about how we incentivize the work that's necessary. I mean, you heard Tommy and everyone in the panel before talking about being able to catalyze that type of action and the need to be able to finance that. We're trying to create that need here. We're trying to accelerate our action. We're trying to use our position to be able to effectively create that market and create it very quickly. One of the key hallmarks of that is that we've proposed a building mandate. And that mandate effectively would say that for buildings over 25,000 square feet in the city, there would be a KBTU per square foot per year cap on the amount of energy you're allowed to use in that building. And we would allow for buildings to be able to be flexible with how they approach that. But for us, it creates an environment where we are doing what's necessary in our part to be able to push the market to be able to respond. And we've also invested $1.2 billion of our own money in our own infrastructure and our own buildings to be able to also create that level of engagement. You know, we operate close to 5,000 buildings in the city, which touches every single borough. So our ability to invest that money over a 10-year capital cycle does actually create the scale necessary to change the cost curve in this market. And we're not just changing the curve around saying that there might be more investment in solar, there might be more investment in efficiency of roofs or of window units. We're also creating a workforce. A workforce that can respond to that, a workforce that can apply those skills not just to our buildings, but to buildings next door, to buildings in the next borough. And the hope is that we are allowing our efforts to de-risk that work for the region as well as for other cities. So we're taking that leadership role very seriously, and we're also trying to effectively change the narrative around what climate action looks like and how do we use whatever means that you have at your disposal to be able to activate it.
Thanks, that's really fantastic. And I think within C40, it's something we thought about a lot. How do you encourage retrofit in the massive building stock out there? And we know the pace isn't happening enough on its own. So we definitely like to learn about how you set your program up. Let's shift now to Paris, to Ms. Myriam Métais, the Budget and Finance Advisor to the Mayor of Paris. Myriam, Paris recently launched a private green investment fund. Can you tell us about why Paris created this fund? How is it helping to meet the climate action goals of the city?
Thank you for inviting me to present this project, which is a very important project that the Mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, has herself pushed forward. Maybe to introduce this project and to make an echo to the President Roundtable. As you know, Paris is strongly committed in tackling climate change, and we have already adopted a green financing strategy concerning our own investment, meaning that we have already issued 2 green bonds according to green bonds principle. The first one in 2015 for an amount of 300 million, and the second one last year, which was a sustainability bond, meaning that we are going to finance both green and social projects for the city of Paris. But besides our own public green financing strategy, we are convinced, and the Mayor of Paris herself was convinced, that we have to organize the participation of private sector to the financing of ecological transition in Paris to reach our very ambitious goals that we have currently updated in a new climate action plan with the ambitious goal to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. So to reach this goal, the Mayor of Paris decided to launch a private investment fund, which is a green investment fund named Paris Green Fund, which is a kind of innovation for city. basically, I'm going to present you the three main characteristics of this fund. The first aim of this fund is to raise capital, mainly private capital, to finance innovative solutions produced by private companies, which could have a positive impact on ecological transition in Paris. So that means that firstly, that's an equity fund. So that's not so common for a local authority, as far as France is concerned, to launch an equity fund. That means that we have get this prerogative from the French government and parliament, and they enabled us to create an equity fund. So this fund is supposed to allocate private capital to small and medium-sized companies that have developed innovative solutions with an effective positive impact on ecological transition. Second characteristic, that's a green fund, basically. The fund can invest in 7 different fields in contributing to ecological transition, meaning climate protection, waste management, air quality, energy efficiency, and so on. And third characteristic, which is maybe the most innovative characteristics, that's a territorial fund, meaning that the companies financed by the fund has to prove that the solutions, the innovative solutions that they are developing have a positive impact on ecological transition in Paris. So that does not mean that the companies receiving funds by the fund have to be located in Paris, but they have to prove that at least one of their innovation is experimented or is tried out in Paris, and that it contributes positively to ecological transition in Paris, and why not in a larger scale elsewhere when this solution would have been tried out. So that's the main characteristics of the fund. Maybe I will let Stephane Villecroze expand on the management issues of the fund. So this fund is managed by an independent asset manager which is Demeter, and Stephane Villecroze is the CEO of Demeter. Demeter had been chosen through an open competition, and is supposed to manage the fund in total independence, but regarding a precise ruling of the fund, in which the city of Paris has defined its investment goals, meaning goals that correspond to our own policy goals in terms of climate change.
Okay, thank you. That's fantastic. I think it's really unusual, innovative how you've structured the Paris Green Fund. So we're really excited to see how that develops and to bring that knowledge to the rest of C40. Let's shift now to London. We have Sir Merrick Cockell who is the chairman of the London Pensions Fund Authority. Sir Merrill, we heard this morning from Dan Zarilli about New York's divestment, big push that they announced earlier this year. I know London has been working for some time on divestment, maybe a little bit more understated in the British style. But we'd love to just hear about what London is doing and how Mayor Khan has used his soft power to work with the LPFA in pushing through divestment.
I think I'll fit into that cultural definition. Anyhow, thank you for inviting me here and to come from one great world city to another. I'm going to talk a bit about the journey we've been on as a pension fund, but probably to give you a bit of context, the London Pension Fund Authority sadly isn't all the local public sector pension funds in London. That would be too simple for, I think, any of our French or American municipal systems, let alone in UK. We're worth about £5.5 billion sterling within the local government pension scheme, which is about 230 billion, but because of how municipal and governments operate in UK, that's divided 89 different ways. Every London borough, of course, has to have its own pension fund for a start, so that's 33 of the 89. Anyhow, with government I'd say support, but also direction, and indeed we went earlier, we decided to pool with colleagues in Lancashire in the north of England, and we've got all our assets and our liabilities and our administration pooled together. We created a company, independent company that we each own half of, called LPP, and that will shortly have about 18 billion sterling under investment. So that's us, and so the journey we've been on really starts with Mayor Sadiq Khan standing for election. I'm a reformed or in remission politician, so I know what it's like to make claims and statements on the campaign trail. So Mayor Khan did this a couple of years ago, and in his manifesto he said that he would take all possible steps to encourage LPFA to divest remaining investments in fossil fuel industries. Well, of course, my pension fund is made up, and this will be familiar territory to many of you, of independent trustees whose first responsibility is fiduciary. We have to make sure we have a funded scheme that pays out our pensions for a very long time, on time, and the right amount. And that absolutely comes first. However, and this is where sort of soft power and leadership comes up against the realities of a hard edge. The Mayor of London appoints me, and he appoints the whole of the board. So clearly we have to listen very carefully to what the Mayor of London says, and that's what we did. So we've been working with his team on the following his electoral success, and we have created our own policy which fits well with the Mayor's policies. And very recently the Mayor encouraged all the London boroughs, over which he really doesn't have any control apart from leadership, to follow our example and look to certainly divest out of fossil fuels and to look at climate change and to learn, and we're very willingly want to be part of that. Of course, there's stretch that comes from the soft power, because I've talked about the joint venture we have with Lancashire, and of course it would be stupid for two equal partners to have different policies around these matters, so we're very closely aligned, and indeed we have Berkshire Pension Fund and others coming in, and of course they will come in under our existing policies because they are sensible and I think right for our times. But that means that actually politicians, their stretch can go beyond what may immediately be apparent. So how did we go from that, the views of an aspiring mayoral candidate to a mayor, and that then becoming my freestanding capital A in legal terms authorities policy? Well, we decided to look at those that were ahead of us in UK, and we heard from the Church of England Pension Fund, from the Environment Agency Pension Fund, which is a government agency, arm's length, and indeed HSBC. And we also took into account what the UK pensions regulator had said, which was to make sure that we didn't, and all pension funds don't simply look at their fiduciary responsibilities, but understand the long-term sustainability of investments. And we actually, we took our time on it. As I say, we learnt from others, and my board came to the conclusion that actually, in the nature of pension funds, to be a good pension fund, to be good investors, to be risk-conscious long-term, and in pension funds we are very long-term investors, that we had to seriously consider the impact on the environment of companies we were investing in or we might look to invest in the future. And I guess what we've seen in really that 2-year process is, I don't know if the term is used in the States, but it's fairly derogatory, but it's tree hugging. Our former Prime Minister, David Cameron, got into huskies and tree hugging and various other things, and this was used as a sort of as I say, a fairly derogatory term to talk about activist pressure. But actually, in the last few years, things have moved way beyond that. So ESG is seen absolutely as secure ground for us setting our strategic asset allocations. And indeed, it's been said earlier today several times that that actually this whole area opens up real opportunities, and that we're not seeing this as something that we've been forced into. We're seeing that actually it begins to open up into areas such as social responsibility and social benefit coming from our investments, that we are looking with it's the next stage really with equal force, that we've looked at climate change and indeed as we look beyond that to the impact of plastics and other things that flow naturally from those investments.
Wonderful. It's fantastic to hear about your journey, and we know divestment is an incredibly complicated, challenging thing to do. But here at C40, we're really eager to learn from the leaders and to share that knowledge. So for this second round of questions, we're going to focus a little bit on the impact of these different, these very diverse but significant initiatives that the cities have, and how they're helping to catalyze and to drive markets. So let's go back to Paris at the end here of the panel to Mr. Stephane Villecroze, who's the managing partner of Demeter Partners. As you heard earlier, Demeter was chosen through a competitive process to manage the Paris Green Fund. So, Stephane, could you just tell us a bit about how you structured the fund, how you're expecting it to deliver results, and what kind of impact do you think it will have on the low-carbon market?
Sure. So if you don't mind, I will just say a few words beforehand on Demeter and how is it possible to have a city as a client, as a LP for a private equity fund. So we are a venture capital and private equity firm. We manage about €1 billion, which make me feel like a drop in a bucket after the figures we mentioned on the previous roundtables. We invest 100% of these funds in ecological and energy transitions, and we don't do so for because we are obliged to do. We don't do so for moral reasons. We invest in these sectors because we feel there are many opportunities. So our job is to finance as majority or minority shareholders startups, SMEs, projects in these fields. And clearly, in the past decades and in the next years, you will see many, many growth stories. And part of our business is to find the tomorrow's champions on these renewables, waste, air, mobility sectors. And there are many, many examples of this revolution ongoing. Believe it or not, and in this country, not everyone believes in this, but renewables are competitive, for example. Believe it or not, but tomorrow you will see EVs in cities and forget about ICE engines vehicles. So our clients, our usual clients are private and public institutional investors, corporates, which also have a look at innovation on these new sectors. And Paris is quite a unique example in France. In fact, for legal reasons, cities usually don't have the right to invest in funds, and they obtain this right to change the law. And it's very important for us because climate change is, of course, a global challenge, but it will be tackled, and it's, the problems will be faced by people on the local scale, farmers, cities, citizens. Our objective with this fund, and again, it's really a small drop in the bucket, is to finance 20 plus SMEs, which will be good examples of innovative solutions which can be deployed in all large cities all over the globe, especially in Paris. And as Myriam said, it can concern mobility, it can concern waste treatment, it can concern, of course, energetic renovation of buildings. And these 20 companies will not change the face of the world, of course, and maybe not have the biggest impact on Paris City either. But these entrepreneurs and these companies will be very remarkable examples to see that things are possible, that tackling this problem makes business opportunities. And probably many, many other entrepreneurial stories will happen without this fund, but we will be one example of the action that Paris City can lead.
Great, thank you very much. And Mark, let's go back to you. So we heard about the 1.2 billion, if I got that right, in the retrofit program, 5,000 some municipal buildings. How do you expect this to impact the market and the supply chain to make it easier for everyone else to retrofit or less expensive?
Sure. I think there's part of the imperative that we've decided on is that we have a responsibility to show what's possible. So to make sure that we as a city are effectively removing any doubt that the ability to technologically achieve the goals that we're setting for everyone else is possible, and it's possible at scale. So investing in our buildings, in the ability for our buildings, which again are, dot the, the 5 boroughs of the city pretty effectively. For you to be able to see that and experience and understand like what is changing and how these buildings are being invested in, that changes the narrative around removing excuses, really, so that when we move to the place, and this is all working in tandem, right? So we're investing in our buildings, we're changing our models of how we do business, we are extracting a lot of data around how buildings can perform at various scales. Simultaneously, we've been investing over the last decade in being able to extract more data from private buildings as well, through benchmarking laws, making sure that we are creating enough of a climate around actionable data for buildings. So when we showcase what's possible, we've been collecting data, building owners know how their buildings are performing. Now it's time to be able to incentivize the action and to make sure that people are actually investing in those buildings. Because I'll tell you what, it makes sense to invest in your buildings. Straight like ROI investments, like you can make the investment, your building will take less money to operate. It is a good thing for you to do. People still aren't doing it. So it's our responsibility and our role in terms of governance and stewardship to create that imperative. And that imperative for us is to say that the voluntary time is past, and now it's time to move forward into setting clear and well-articulated standards for what buildings in 2018 and moving forward need to look like. And I think that is something that we have a unique ability to do here. Now we're approaching it with a certain sense of realism. Buildings can't turn over automatically overnight. And we've all benefited across the US from a lot of fuel switching, New York as well. But now it's time for the hard work. And part of that is saying that we know that buildings have certain replacement time cycles, when you're going to change your boilers out, when you're going to change your windows. Those things can align with a timeline that we've set, which is in 2030. By then, buildings need to be able to showcase to us that they have invested the money that allows for the buildings to be operating in a way that showcases that we are taking care of our buildings so that they can take care of us. And after that, there will be stiff penalties if buildings are not performing to that extent. A building that's, say, of, 30,000 square feet or so, that is far above the cap, could see penalties of as much as $60,000 a year. Similarly, a building of 1 million square feet could see penalties in excess of $2 million a year. We are past the time for easy choices. We're past the time for simple solutions. Now it's time for us to be as serious as the climate that we're facing demands. And New York City, we're trying to take that as seriously as possible, and we're also trying to effectively make it more possible for other cities to be able to do the same thing.
That's amazing. Okay, and then back to London, Sir Merrill. What kind of impact do you expect from London's divestment efforts, and in particular the reinvestment story, which has been part and parcel of the London divestment strategy?
What I talked about earlier was really the sort of the easy bit of adopting a policy, and often the date's set a long way in the future. Not the case with us. We've actually set 2020. I might even still be chair of the pension fund by then, so would be personally accountable. And that's really the day after tomorrow in these terms. We adopted the policy in May of last year. And that set a clear timetable with our operators, LPP. So it's not entirely in our hands. We set the strategy, and that's implemented by the company that we co-own. And the first thing they've had to do was to review the initial headline climate change characteristics by the start of this year. So we've already had some reports on that, and looking at both the physical risk and the transition risk and other elements, and indeed to carry out a full analysis of actually what we hold. And I thought it would be quite simple to ask, well, what do we actually own? Of course, it isn't remotely as that simple, particularly in pension funds. It's often difficult to know what every company that you may even directly have investments in does. It's easy if it's Exxon or an obvious petroleum industry, but there are lots of service industries and others. So getting to the bottom of that. Fund managers. We use fewer fund managers now. We do more in-house management ourselves, but still we've got investments and funds of funds, and getting to the bottom of that, because we can't just say, oh well, that's all too difficult, or we actually have to look to you, the fund managers, to explain exactly what our money is invested in, and we have to explain that to Londoners. So the work's been going on listed equities, on private equities, and indeed on infrastructure. And of course, it's not just simply saying we'll get out of everything that whatever the harm it might do to the fund. We have to look at the behaviours of those companies that we may have investments in. How do we evaluate that? We're part of the Transition Pathway Initiative, which is an excellent scheme, which is being broadened the whole time, but actually identifying corporates and their behaviour, and beginning to bring some real change in using our collective weight. And certainly in the local government pension scheme in UK, we operate together in many areas, including employment practice and other such things beyond climate change. So how's this, you asked me, how's that changed our investments? Well, as I mentioned just now, we took a decision some time ago to bring certain areas in-house, certain asset classes in-house, and in particular that's around infrastructure. And we created with a different set of partners this time from Lancashire, but Greater Manchester pension fund. We set up something called GLIL, which is an infrastructure fund, really on the basis that we should stop talking about doing things together and actually just put some money on the table and get on with it. And that we started about 4 years ago. We each put $250 million nationally on the table, and that's now, we've brought in other partners. That's about $1.3 billion. I should think by the end of this year, it'll be $2 billion in infrastructure. About 7.5% of our assets are in infrastructure. And between that and GLIL, it's in a whole variety of areas, sadly few directly in London. That's, I guess, part of the problem is identifying the right sort of investments, particularly in cities, and we've heard reference to that earlier today. But we've got wind farms or shares of wind farms both in Scotland and Clyde Wind Farm, in Portugal. We've got biomass and biogas in Australia and in UK, and indeed some of the biogas plants have been entirely funded by local government pension schemes, one in particular taking mainly the waste from an ice cream factory outside York, and there are endless, I think, opportunities in those sort of areas. Certainly in UK, we've hardly scratched the surface of those power generation alternatives. More recently, I suppose our most recent significant investment has been into water, into 7.5% of Anglian water, which provides the water needs of about 6 million people in East Anglia and about 124,000 businesses. That's a significant new area of utilities for us. And indeed also energy efficient rolling stock on our railways. We are interested in transport, and that does directly impact London. That rolling stock comes in and helps commuters and others get into our capital city. Beyond that, we're certainly, you in the States are far more involved in homes for rent long term. That's an asset class that you and many European countries have in common. In UK, it's hardly got going at all. We're in our first residential development, only about 70 million sterling, so it's a toe in the water, but it's an area that fits very well with our long-termism. People generally pay their rents. You've seen the benefits in this country. We need homes very badly. My pensioners, when I go and meet them, as I do in a very large event annually, want to know that something's being done to help their children and grandchildren, and homes is an area, and that fits. That's a logical extension of some of the new investments that we're going to be looking at in future.
Great. So we've heard some fantastic examples of how these cities are using their leadership, their power, and really demonstrating the vision and aligning with values. And I heard this phrase a couple times, demonstrating or showing that it's possible, which is really fantastic. So we've got a little bit of time for questions. These are all really interesting programs. So have we got anyone who'd like to come forward? And please identify your name, organization, and if there's a particular person on the panel that you'd like to direct your question to.
Okay, hi, I'm Marcine Mitchell. I'm with IFC and the private sector arm of the World Bank. I also work as a board member for the Green Bank of Montgomery County. And this is to Mark. You talked about the retrofit and using regulation as a lever to get these retrofits done. And so my question is about capacity. So what is the capacity, of the city in order to actually enforce this kind of regulation? This would be a major movement in order to actually see that this is done on the ground. What kind of capacity do you need? This is an issue for a lot of cities, especially smaller cities. It's one thing to have the regulation, but there's another thing to be able to actually enforce it and see that these things are done. So what do you anticipate in terms of extra staff or extra regulations or costs, et cetera, to get this actually done?
I think it's a great question. One thing I also mentioned before is meeting people where they are, and the same thing applies to constituents, and the same thing applies to residents of your cities. The fact that we have embarked in this process that will require more kind of data coming from our buildings is in part because of the groundwork we've laid ahead of time. So many places have benchmarking laws, which already gets owners into the habits of having to report annual information. And so utilizing the framework of how building owners are communicating with your city, the same way in which why PACE can be so successful, because you're effectively paying back your loans through your property taxes. Find ways in which building owners are already engaged and already communicating those pathways with your city governments and your municipalities. Those are going to be the best channels to be able to build on, as opposed to looking at this as a larger bureaucracy and a larger set of new pathways. Absolutely, there's going to need to be more bodies on this, and I think that what we've also established, and part of the plan of this, is to build capacity where that information is already coming into the city, so that whether that is through different cities' departments of environments or through finance entities, those are the places where a little bit of tweaking and capacity building from existing channels is where you're going to see, I think, much more development and much more ability for cities to actually manage the flow of information.
Great, thank you. Have we got more questions from the audience?
Hi, my name is Simone Andrews, and I'm with Moody's Investor Service. I just had a quick follow-up question around divestment as a strategy, and maybe the other cities can talk about using divestment as a long-term strategy to kind of move capital, and just the challenges of balancing divestment strategies with returns for your pensioners, or wherever it lies.
Despite what I've been saying earlier, our starting point at my pension fund was pretty good. I think the benchmark, certainly in UK, on fossil fuels is something around 6%. Actually, less than 2% of our entire holdings. So we're talking sort of under 100 million, well under 100 million pounds, is actually in fossil fuels, and about 2.25% of our investments are already in clean energy and associated industries. So this is the principle has got to be got right. Actually, the scale of divestment in sort of risk to the fund terms is such that I believe that we will do all our evaluations that I've talked about in good time, and that we will take the right decisions over individual investments, and we will exit them by or within 2020 without detriment to our funds. If there still remain investments that are long-term, are in companies who are not only saying the right things but doing the right things, then there could well be a case for us to continue that. First and foremost, we cannot harm the overall performance of the pension fund and our responsibility to our current and future pensioners. But the scale of it is not as great as it might be in some other pension funds.
And I'll just add to that. Similarly, in terms of New York and the scale, the $5 billion that we'll be divesting still falls within the lane of our pension funds having a very clear and fiduciary responsibility. That is not changed. That is ironclad. It is no longer risk-free in a lot of ways from the point of view of just the pensions to be invested in fossil fuels. So it is something in which it makes it is a justifiable divestment on all bases. And to my point earlier, it is also no longer consistent with our values. So I think that as a city, you're able to both set the horizon for where we need to be and what is our value structure for a city, and from the pension board, who has a very particular and kind of solemn responsibility to to its members, they also can look at this from a point of view of risk aversion and make the same determination. It is risky to be invested in fossil fuels now. And so as that becomes clearer, it becomes much easier, and a lot of times you then can match that political will, that value structure, with the fiduciary responsibility in a way that is far more clear than it has been up until this point.
Great. We've got time for a couple more questions.
Hi, Satya Rhodes Conway. I'm the Managing Director of the Mayor's Innovation Project. And I wonder if each of you might say a few words about how smaller or mid-sized cities can learn from the work that you're doing, or if there's any way in which you're helping other cities in your places to take the same kind of leadership that you all have taken.
All right, I'll jump in first. So I think that it's important for us to, again, acknowledge that we're all in this together. And so larger cities, smaller mid-tier cities, they all have a responsibility to work with each other and to share so that everyone is not starting from zero. One thing that I'm kind of most excited about, and you mentioned innovation, and I was thinking about this earlier, part of the ability for us to allow for our work to benefit other cities is by being more innovative with how we're approaching our work. One of the more recent strategies that we've undertaken is something that is similar to some other cities. Is we launched something called NYCX, which is a challenge platform for New York City, in which we are taking city-scale problems and pushing them out to the tech and design communities to help us solve them. In particular, this challenge we launched around the need for us to quickly advance the charging infrastructure for electric vehicles. We got about $10 million from the mayor originally, with more money on the way, to begin the process of the creation of fast-charging electric vehicle hubs all throughout the city. We launched the challenge to the tech and design community to say, we have this money, we know we need to be able to invest in charging as we transition away from the internal combustion engine. How are we going to do that in a way that acknowledges how people move, how they operate, how they consume information, and how we exist now in 2018. We don't want to be, doing the version of, overhead power lines right now. We need to be thoughtful about that. And the responses, because of the approach is atypical, have been substantial. We've been able to really come up with some really new innovative projects that we're going to test bed in New York City. And one of the great parts about that is that the finalists for this challenge, because of the partnership, are going to participate in the same type of challenge in the city of Paris. So it allows for there to be connections that are atypical and that are more innovative, but also for us to be able to do more than one thing at a time in more than one place. And I think that's the way we need to start strategizing as cities kind of look at themselves a little bit differently in the wake, particularly in the US, of federal abdication of responsibility.
Maybe concerning the Paris Green Fund, clearly we are in a perspective in which we consider that cities are facing same kind of challenges regarding mobility, waste management, air quality and climate protection, and more broadly. And that's the reason why we consider that the solutions developed by the companies financed by the fund might be duplicable to other cities. In terms of governance, to share our own experience, we are going to set up a strategic committee, which won't be in the decision-making process of the fund, but which will be a kind of prospective board in charge of identifying investment needs, but also to suggest duplication of some solutions, innovative solutions financed to other cities.
Maybe a few words on the metrics. Can a smaller city than Paris launch such an initiative? Probably yes. Just to illustrate this, Paris Green Fund is a 200 million euro fund, and Paris is committed on 15 million, 1.5, so it's just a small part of it. And this amount will be invested in, let's say, 4 to 5 to 6 years. So it's quite reasonable, and it will not, of course, cost a single euro to Paris taxpayers. I'm one of them. Because if we work properly, this 15 million will become 30 million within a few years. So you can really address these microeconomical examples with a limited amount of resources.
It's one of the reasons I'm here is that we've moved from setting a policy to actually implementing it and showing how we've done that, and that my independent trustees have done it in a very professional way, hopefully will encourage not just major cities, but certainly around UK pension funds and cities and towns of all size, that actually this isn't a fringe activity anymore. This is actually, this is all part of being good, long-term, responsible investors who are looking at risk the whole time. This is good. This is a good way of operating if you're investing, certainly in our case, public sector workers' pensions, and that's why we're working, certainly with the Mayor of London, to get that message across beyond London centrally, and indeed with partners in C40 and elsewhere, that this is mainstream now.
Well, that's a great way to close the panel. So please join me in thanking our panelists for today.